Hello everyone, welcome to the Drydock episode 210. This week the questions are taken from guide 254 to the Wapen von Hamburg, and the Wednesday video, the development of US Navy tactics 1939 to 1945, which was of course with special guest Trent Hone. So let's get along with the questions. Pete asks, was there much in the way of piracy in the North Sea and Baltic during the Age of Sail? Assuming there must have been if the Hanseatics-Hamburg felt the need to escort vessels going up into the Arctic, and if there was, which navies do you suppose took the lead in their suppression? I'd presume that the English, Dutch and Danish fleets would have taken the lead in such work. Yes, in the early part of the classic Age of Sail there was actually a huge amount of piracy in the North Sea, and this came from essentially three sources. The first and most basic source was the source of piracy that had troubled the North Sea, the English Channel, basically all the waters of Northern Europe from pretty much the time there'd been any major trade worth raiding, and that would just be, local people who decided they needed a bit more supplies, a bit more cash, etc. And, there were these foreign merchant ships just sailing off the coast full of relatively unguarded valuables. And when I say foreign, then that kind of time period, that doesn't necessarily mean of a different nation. If, for example, you were a pirate in the English Channel and you lived somewhere near Plymouth, well, someone from Portsmouth was probably just as foreign to you as someone from Brittany, so why not take their stuff as well? After all, if no one knows that you took it, because you leave no survivors, then, well, you can even resell it to the people ashore. Nonetheless, that's a fairly basic form of piracy, and to be honest, it was mostly on its way out towards the end of the medieval period and the beginning of the classic Age of Sail. The other two sources, which were the primary sources of piracy in the time period that you refer to, the first being what you might term privateers turned pirates. Bearing in mind the Hanseatic League was made up of numerous independent city-states, and as a result, not just them, but the entirety of the northern European coastline was made up of a lot of much, much smaller individual powers than you might imagine looking at a map of Europe today. And even within those powers, you could have rival factions of noblemen who didn't like other factions of noblemen who happened to be, technically speaking, under the same ruler. And so what you would quite often have is one lot of nobles or a small nation of some description would be at odds with another, and they would, as well as engaging in the general back and forth of early Age of Sail warfare, they would engage the services of private individuals to help them in their harassment of enemy shipping, with obviously a profit-sharing agreement. But when those disputes ended, quite often those people were like, you know what, we were getting fairly rich from doing this, and if we don't have to cut in our sponsors on a share of the profits, we can get even richer doing this, so we'll just keep doing it. And if we have to move off to a separate little hideaway to do so, then so be it. And then the other semi-related source of piracy was just basically people along the same lines who just skipped the step of at any point being a legitimized privateer and just going, we're going to set ourselves up for a life of high seas crime. And they also would hide out in a lot of places. It didn't necessarily mean that the nations whose coastlines they were haunting actually sponsored them. More the fact that a lot of the time those coastlines were so sparsely inhabited, and the nations in question having quite a lot else to worry about, that they just couldn't afford to scout and enforce the law on every single tiny little island, fjord, enclave, etc. that they happened to technically possess. So Sweden and Denmark, as their borders existed back then, were quite the pirate havens at various points, because their coastlines are very irregular, very easy to hide in, and both of them had some rather larger national level conflicts to worry about. So if there was small infestations of pirates hiding out in uninhabited bays, they genuinely really didn't care, as long as those pirates didn't go after their own ships. The Hanseatic League, of course, which was making most of the money from trade, really did care, hence ships like the Wapen von Hamburg. And eventually the Hanseatic forces would root out and execute quite a number of the major pirates, which is in some ways what actually gives rise to the start of the classical age of piracy, which is where you get things like Pirates of the Caribbean being inspired by, because although piracy would continue, it was suddenly much, much more profitable and much easier to conduct it in the Atlantic and the Caribbean areas than the increasingly closed off and well-patrolled North Sea. Edward Dunn asks, were there plans to refit the E-class cruisers, and if so, what were they? Being fairly large, fast and long range, I imagine they'd be quite valuable, so keeping them as 6-inch cruisers makes some sense. But given the number of cruisers the Royal Navy was already building, could they have made useful anti-aircraft cruisers, or was something else planned? There weren't any major plans for full AA refits of the Emerald or E-class cruisers. There was some consideration for considerable increase in their anti-aircraft battery, primarily replacing the single 4-inch with twin 4-inch, which was actually pretty much a standard refit that was done across a lot of Royal Navy cruisers in the interwar period and the early part of World War II. But although these plans existed, then were scrapped with the outbreak of war, and then of course, as mentioned in the video on them, in 1942-43 they got refitted anyway with some additional light anti-aircraft weaponry. There doesn't appear to have been any major plans to convert them into anti-aircraft cruisers the way that some of the C-class and Danae were. Now, with that said, that was done largely because the C's and D's were initially planned as stopgap anti-aircraft vessels that would be scrapped in relatively short order, and then their anti-aircraft weaponry could be taken off and used on other ships, basically to kind of hold the line until the more modern vessels of the fleet could be in turn refitted to a much better anti-aircraft gun standard. Whereas Enterprise and Emerald, because they were considerably larger, were basically still wanted as 6-inch gun cruisers. However, if for whatever reason someone had decided, actually, you know what, we are going to refit these ships as anti-aircraft vessels, it could have been done. Now, based on the layout of the E-class, some of the refits to the C-class and so forth, an ideal, and this is stressing ideal because, you know, in some cases the guns just weren't available, but an ideal Enterprise or Emerald refit to a anti-aircraft vessel, if you're going whole hog, then you would replace all of the 6-inch guns. So you'd have the aft 2 super-firing single 6s replaced by twin 4s. The same with Emerald, you'd have the 2 forward super-firing 6 inches replaced by twin 4s. On Enterprise, you'd have to take off that twin 6-inch forward and put in a pair of twin 4s. You then have the 2 wing mounts just aft of the second funnel. Those are single 6. Those can be replaced with twin 4s as well. You can upgrade the 3 existing single 4s to twin 4s, which, as I said, was what they were planning to do anyway, but never got round to it. Now, the last remaining 6-inch that's just aft of the third funnel is not really worth, in my opinion, replacing directly, because it sits between the aft superstructure and the aft funnel. It doesn't have a huge arc of fire as far as an anti-aircraft gun is concerned, and it's also surrounded by boats. Now, if you maybe then take it off and replace it by sticking a twin 4 on the aft superstructure, that might work. And then, of course, you have aircraft launching and handling facilities, which you'd be replacing with the twin 4, because you don't really need a scout plane if you're an anti-aircraft cruiser. The aircraft is supposed to come to you, not the other way around. And by rearranging a little bit of the deck layout, I think you could get another pair of wing-mounted twin 4s in as well, which in theory, under this maximalist interpretation, would give you, in theory, 12 twin 4-inch mounts, i.e. 24 4-inch guns. And if you don't do the rearrangement that I suggested, then you'd still have 10 for a total of 20 4-inch guns, of which most could be brought to bear on a broadside, but you'd have either 4 or 6 guns unable to bear on the broadside on the opposite side, depending on which version of the ship you went with. And that's before we get into things like potentially removing some or all of the torpedo armament, where potentially, at least weight-wise, you might be able to fit some more 4-inch guns. You'd have to find lots of space for all the ammunition and the crew to run them as well. So I think, to be on the safe side, I'd say the 10-mount version with the 20 guns would be probably the one that would, in practice, be carried out, and with the ship probably retaining at least some of its torpedo armament. And that would make it a pretty darn effective anti-aircraft cruiser, certainly for its size, and the fact of obviously being very fast, it would make a very good anti-aircraft escort for carriers. Brendan Buersdorf asks, is there a semi-realistic what-if scenario where any pirates active in the 1800s could in some way have gotten ironclad vessels, allowing piracy to continue for a while longer? It's theoretically possible. There were enough ironclads in the hands of some relatively unstable states and or states that ceased to exist in the 1800s, so a crew going rogue or some enterprising infiltration attempt, in theory, could have grabbed a small ironclad and made off with it in order to conduct piracy operations. However, in practice, it's not really a realistic proposition for quite a few reasons. Firstly, given how rare ironclads were during the first part of the second half of the 19th century, if a pirate group had gotten hold of an ironclad of any way, shape or form — I've used HMS Wyvern here as an example, because you could have, let's say it was actually completed and delivered slightly earlier, so it ended up being delivered to the Confederates, and then its crew decided to go rogue. That's a theoretical example. But a pirate group in control of such a powerful vessel, a vessel that could take on and destroy significant numbers of actual full-on warships, would lead to basically anyone who had a serious ironclad force at that point all banding up to hunt it down and destroy it in short order. It's just too much of a threat. Secondly, the complexity and weaponry of such a vessel would make it very difficult for the pirates to maintain it, because one, it now is obviously using steam power, and that means you've got to maintain and run the engines, and when they break you need spare parts, and there's only so many places you can get those around the time of the ironclad, which would mean you'd have to somehow arrange for the purchase and manufacture of these things, which would raise quite a few red flags and make this ship very easy to spot and to anticipate. It would be kind of like someone showing up on the doors of major arms dealer these days and saying, I would like to buy some parts for, I think it's LM2500 gas turbine engines or something like that, or for Olympus gas turbines, if you want to go slightly further back in history. It's like they're not widely manufactured, and the fact you're asking for very specifically something like a warship power plant spare parts kind of trips a lot of flags. Related to that, the armament of ironclads was what you might call full-on military caliber weapons, and if you remember from one of the previous Drydocks, I pointed out most pirates tended to use the smaller caliber weapons that you tended to find on merchant ships, specifically because, well, one, you didn't need anything that much heavier to take on a merchant ship, and two, it meant you could restock from merchant ships that you captured, because most merchant ships carried some form of armament. Whereas if you're carrying 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 15-inch guns on some kind of 1860s or 1870s ironclad, again, like with the machinery parts, there are only certain manufacturers for those kind of rounds, and they don't sell to pirates, generally speaking. And finally, there's also the matter of disguise. Half of a pirate's success is his ability to blend in with general shipping, unless and until he wants to strike. An ironclad is a very distinctive vessel, and therefore you're not going to blend in any way, shape or form, which is going to make you much easier to spot, and therefore much easier to hunt down by basically everyone who wants you dead. And as mentioned at the top of this answer, that's going to be a very long list. Neutral History asks, how effective were land-based anti-ship batteries compared to going out there with a cruiser or battleship, and were they ever more effective? Well, one of the fundamental issues is, of course, a cruiser or a battleship can be an offensive or a defensive tool, and it can go all over the place, whereas an anti-ship battery can only be in one place because you build it and then it doesn't tend to move. Now, in terms of effectiveness, it varies quite considerably both over time in terms of what technology is available and how that stacks up better on ships or on land, but it also depends on the type of fortification, both the type of fortification you can build with the technology of the time and the type of fortification that the local terrain allows you to build. So, for example, a relatively small anti-ship battery on land with some powerful, for the time, guns that are overlooking a very narrow section of waterway can be exceptionally effective, far more effective than a cruiser or battleship. The problem is that those particular circumstances are incredibly rare and location dependent. So, for example, the Oscaborg fortress outside of Oslo, which obviously famously sank Blücher and gave Lützow a rather bloody nose, that's a good example of an anti-ship battery that did a far, far more effective job than a theoretical cruiser or small capital ship that was mounting the same amount of armament could have done. But that's because mainly its location. You had to sail past it, you had to sail at fairly close range, and at that point its guns could do an awful lot of damage and it was very difficult for them to miss. But with that said, even in that kind of situation, if the Germans had known Oscaborg was operational, they could have bombarded it from slightly further up the fjord and maybe helped themselves out a little bit. But there are variations to that layout which might even obviate that, say if the approach is fairly winding, so you can't get a direct line of sight from long range. So yeah, there are certain cases where they're more effective, but generally speaking, they are less effective because they tend to have fewer guns, normally, apart from very, very concentrated fortifications in sort of major naval bases. They tend to cost almost as much as a battleship or cruiser, and indeed when you're building batteries with as many guns as a battleship or cruiser, they actually tend to cost more because, again, as I said before, you have to excavate everything and then build everything, which tends to obviate the savings made by not having to build things like propulsion machinery, because you still need some form of machinery to provide power, you still need accommodation, you still need magazines, you still need shell hoists, you still need some kind of fire control equipment, etc., etc., etc. And of course, the flexibility offered by ships means that if you have, let's say, 40 15-inch guns and you have 10 ports, you can distribute them 4 guns to a port. But if the enemy puts those same 40 guns on a bunch of battleships, then they can turn up with all 40 of their guns to face 4 of yours, which is usually a losing proposition. And the other 36 guns that you might have in the other ports don't matter in the slightest in that particular engagement. And the other issue is that coastal forts tend to fall behind relatively quickly in periods of significant technological advancement. One, it's much less cost effective to upgrade forts, because if you, say, invent a brand new rangefinder or fire control system and you have a battleship with 8, 9 or 10 guns and you stick that new fire control system or rangefinder on that ship, you've now upgraded the capability of 8, 9 or 10 guns, and they're very mobile, so they can go lots of places. If you pay the same amount for the same fire control system or rangefinder and you stick it in a fort, you've only improved the effectiveness of probably 2 or 3 guns, and they can only guard the sort of 15-20 mile radius that they are built near. So therefore, when these upgrades come about, they tend to be assigned to the ships first, and then if a war breaks out, you tend to find that unless that fort has been built pretty much the year before, the ship that turns up will have more advanced systems than you do. Another factor is that they just might build ships with bigger guns. So if everybody's mounting 12-inch guns and you build a fort with 12-inch guns, fantastic. Then somebody turns around and builds a ship with 14 or 15-inch guns. Well, those ships being constructed in the yards and able to be fitted in the yards where the guns are available and the heavy machinery to move them is available is much, much easier to do than trucking those same heavy guns over land and somehow figuring out a way of expanding and installing them into pre-existing fortification mounts. So you very often can find a fortification is outgunned. And lastly, there's the fixed nature of them. Basically, if you build a fort, everyone knows you built a fort, everyone knows what armament that fort is, so then they can calculate exactly what they need to bring to bear. So even if, in theory, you've built a Doom fortress that is just as good or perhaps even better than a single battleship, and maybe it costs a fraction less, something like, say, Fort Drum, then the enemy can just go, okay, well, we know that's there, so when we want to attack it, we just need to show up with 2, 3, 4 battleships, and just keep hitting it until either it gives in, or if it's isolated, just besiege it until it runs out of supplies, because, again, it's not mobile. What shore batteries are, however, quite effective at doing is dissuading smaller craft from showing up, smaller craft that their guns can and will destroy, and because the one advantage of them not being mobile is that they are a permanent 24/7 presence, which will force your opponent to devote considerably greater resources if they want to attack that area than they would otherwise. Because an undefended section of coastline, of course, you can send your landing ships in quite happily, whereas if you look at something like D-Day, whilst the German coastal batteries weren't exactly all that effective in destroying the D-Day landing forces, that's in large part because it forced the Allies to devote a significant number of bombardment vessels to knock out or suppress those shore batteries. Josh Thomas Moore asks, on a few dreadnought ships I've noticed this tower-like structure on top of some of the turrets, like on a picture of the Congo class. They have one on the rearmost turret with said towers being connected by cables to the ship's masts. What are these towers for, and how did the cables not snap off when the guns turned? Now, you're right, you can see these on a number of pictures. I'm using a War Thunder render here, basically because it shows it fairly clearly, whereas in a lot of the pictures you kind of have to squint to see it. Nevertheless, here is Congo with aforementioned tower on the back. Now, these towers, as you can hopefully also see from this picture, are actually there to support the lines that are running from the mast there, back and forth, obviously forward to the superstructure and back to the gun turret. And these lines are generally speaking for radio communications. They're basically very long radio antenna. The way you get them to not snap when the turret turns is that you position them such that the very top where the cable is mounted is exactly above the turret's center of rotation. So as the turret turns, the tip of the tower doesn't actually undergo any lateral movement. It is just turning on the spot. And the cables themselves you would mount on some kind of bearing supported sliding mount, so that although the physical tower itself is turning, the cable and the thing it's directly attached to are not turning. So kind of a free floating mounting. And this is basically just to help pick up long distance radio transmissions, and occasionally, depending on the setup of the ship, transmit things as well. Alexander Matheson asks, the Mark I tank used a naval 6-pounder gun. Why was this gun selected for the tank? And are there many other naval guns used as tank cannon? The gun was selected for a couple of reasons. I mean, there's a lot more to it, including some reasons why the Navy was rather glad to get rid of it, which would turn this answer into a much longer one. But the primary and brief version is that the Royal Navy didn't particularly want its 6-pounders anymore. By World War I, they were generally sort of 20 plus years old, some of them considerably more so, and thus they were no longer effective. I mean, secondary batteries of capital ships were well past the 6-pounder, which is a 57mm gun. Even Dreadnought had 12-pounders, and so a 6-pounder was basically something you found in the tertiary or quaternary batteries of pre-Dreadnoughts. So the Royal Navy wasn't exactly going to miss them. Even the earliest destroyers tended to have at least 3-inch guns, which are roughly 75-76mm. So the Royal Navy had a fair number of them, and they were about the right size, shape and compactness to be mounted in what is effectively a casement mounting stuck on a sponson. So, you know, that certainly wasn't outside of the realm of adaptation for an already existing naval gun. And the army had a real shortage of guns, as was explained actually in the recent Sea and Arsenal collaboration video. When it came even to small arms, the army just wanted as many guns as it could possibly get its hands on, ideally all of the same caliber and type, whereas the Navy, when it came to the smaller side of artillery, didn't care all that much as long as stuff on the particular ship was all the same. And as I said, especially in the case of the 6-pounder, they really didn't care all that much. It wasn't a viable anti-surface combat weapon anymore, so they were happy to get rid of it. And for the army, it meant they didn't have to divert stocks of their existing artillery from the artillery park to the tank divisions. As it turned out, however, as you can see with this Mark III, the original 6-pounder was actually quite a long barrel weapon for land-based usage, and it kept getting stuck when tanks went over big ditches and trenches. So in the end, it was dropped, and in the Mark IV tank going forward, they had a modified short barrel version. So only the Mark I to III used the original longer barrel 6-pounder that was almost pretty much directly from naval use. Now, as far as using other naval guns on tanks, there was a little bit of a lull in the interwar period because, as mentioned, the Navy had generally gone to kind of a minimum of 3 to 4 inch, and in the interwar period, a 75 or 105 mil gun was pretty darn rare and basically impossible to find if you were looking for the long barrel high velocity versions that the Navy was using. But then once you got into World War II and you started seeing long barrel armor piercing weapons in the 75, 76, 100, 105, 120 millimeter range and upwards, now you were back in the territory of naval guns. And in the immediate aftermath of World War II, as well as people sort of standardized around 105, 120 mil and so forth, there was a certain degree of crossover between naval guns, specifically secondary, usually anti-aircraft dual-purpose guns, and tank weaponry, because as it turned out, a 100 and something millimeter fast-firing, high-velocity, long-range gun, which is what the navies wanted for their anti-aircraft purposes and anti-surface action to a lesser and lesser extent, also happened to be almost exactly the right thing for a tank to have. Although there's not as much of a crossover as you might think, there are a few rather notable tanks that do have naval guns, or what started out as naval guns, sitting in their turrets. Someone with an unpronounceable jumble of letters and numbers asks, if World War II hadn't broken out, how much longer do you think it would have taken for carriers to take over? Would it have taken a later demonstration in a war, or would peacetime development be sufficient to change? Obviously, it is a little difficult to say. Certainly carriers were featuring more and more in people's estimation of, what should be considered a full-on capital ship, although this was differing quite considerably between different navies. And you have to realise that without radar, which really only starts to see full-scale deployment and use in the Second World War, and whose deployment and use, whilst it probably still would have come about in the early 1940s, might have been slightly delayed and certainly wouldn't have been anywhere near as quickly rolled out. There was a certain degree of sense to what was being said by people who thought that battleships, especially fast battleships, could still have a significant role. As you will have noticed from the latest Fleet Problems video, okay, fair enough, it was the beginning of the 1930s, but there was a significant problem with that in a number of fleet exercises, not just in the US Navy, but across others, of carriers being caught out by fast surface vessels, which they didn't see coming because they just had visual spotting to work on, and aerial spotting was not a 100% guarantee that you'd actually see what was going on. I mean, just look at how many times people missed each other in the Second World War as well. So the vulnerability of carriers to surface action definitely factored in, and there were arguments, a fast battleship that could move almost as quickly, or in some cases as quickly as a cruiser, might therefore be able to pull off a very quick kill of a carrier. Obviously, carrier aircraft ranges were increasing, which would make that somewhat less likely, but they weren't increasing to the point where at the sort of start of the Second World War would be seen by most navies as insurmountable issues, such as night or prolonged periods of storm weather. That those things could give shelter to capital ships that were closing on carrier position. Of course, how they knew where the carrier was another matter entirely, but in theory, the one side or the other would be defending or attacking a fixed location, and the other side would be trying to stop them. So there was a certain degree of geographical tie-down. Plus, of course, new defensive technologies, dual-purpose batteries, improved anti-aircraft weapons, improved anti-aircraft fire control directors, improved anti-torpedo defences, better deck armour, etc., all being rolled out on capital ships. There was, of course, obviously the argument that was even being had during the first part of the Second World War that no moving, well-defended modern capital ship had ever been hit or sunk by aircraft, and whilst carriers could get larger as the treaty system began to collapse, so could battleships, and a carrier being larger just means it can loft more aircraft. The aircraft capabilities themselves don't inherently get better, whereas battleships' durability and firepower does get quite a bit better as the capital ships get larger. So if World War II hadn't broken out, and you had potentially people starting to respond to the Yamatos, and you had 50, 60, 70, 80,000 ton battleships rolling around with very deep anti-torpedo protection systems, a dozen plus dual-purpose anti-aircraft guns per side, especially if auto-loading systems or radar guidance, etc., start to come in, proximity fuses may be being developed as well, and aircraft technology not being driven by war is perhaps not advancing quite as quickly as it does during the Second World War, but then it's entirely possible that there could have been a fairly long period during a peacetime 1940 era where it might have been a legitimate argument that actually maybe aircraft couldn't get close enough to a corral of well-defended modern warships. Of course, then eventually jet and aircraft would come about, newer long-range airborne weapons would come about, and the balance would begin to tip more towards to what we see it today. But it probably would have taken a lot longer for people to also realise that. And I know, there is this argument of, does war drive the improvement of technology? And it's kind of yes and no. It's not an absolute. On the one hand, yes, war does encourage you to start building a lot of what you already know. But war also encourages people, assuming the conflict lasts long enough, to start trying to think of increasingly out there ways of getting an upper hand over the enemy and shortening the development cycle because people want it out there now. So you kind of have a two-part system where, like, say, look at the Royal Navy's wartime emergency flotillas or the US Navy's decision to just keep building Fletchers. You could argue that in some ways it curtails the development of destroyers compared to the rather rapid increases in destroyer capability that were going on in the late 1930s. But on the flip side of that, the anti-aircraft fire control systems, anti-aircraft ammunition, and in some cases anti-aircraft weaponry equipped to those destroyers, and radar for more general purposes as well, that advances considerably faster than anyone can reasonably have expected it to in the early 1940s without the fact there's a war on poking people in the back. Field Marshal Baltimore asks, in the second part of the US Naval Doctrine video, my question is, did any of the coloured US war plans take into account the naval or army seizure of dry docks or naval bases, or in the Rainbow plans, any potential dry docks or naval bases being used in Allied territory? If there weren't dry docks in the Philippines to support US Navy repairs, maybe they could have acquired temporary access to Allied or neutral bases? So most of the US war plans focused on the idea of the US fighting alone. So there would only be the US, the enemy, and neutrals. And as long as another nation was neutral, you couldn't rely on access to their bases, dry docks, etc. It'd be nice if you got them, but that's not something to plan an entire war around. There were, of course, war plans where the US did count on having allies for that particular exercise, and in those cases, yes, they would assume that they would have some access to those facilities, assuming, of course, that the enemy didn't destroy or neutralize them. But when it comes to seizing enemy dry docks or naval bases, the US war plans tended to work on the assumption that the enemy would treat those facilities pretty much like how the US would treat their own facilities if they were under threat of capture, i.e. they would do their level best to deny them to the enemy by blowing them up, wrecking machinery, if they've got floating dry docks like the one in the picture, sinking them, etc., etc. So, and I mean, it's fairly logical. It would be a dangerous thing to assume your enemy is incompetent enough to leave such things, ready to be used in your hands, and it would be dangerously optimistic to think that a major assault onto a major enemy facility could be carried so quickly enough to, seize it before the enemy could enact those plans, because, as I said, the US knew full well from its own plans that it's not exactly that difficult to pre-rig a naval base to deny its use to the enemy, because these kinds of things don't come out of the blue. It's fairly obvious when there's a build-up to such an attack. And so they didn't count on being able to use any enemy bases that they might have overrun. They did account for the fact that the harbour, the anchorage itself, might be useful, and that over time they might be able to either repair the facilities that were there or bring in their own facilities, like these floating dry docks, which are then obviously very useful in calm waters. But generally speaking, the US war plans were fairly sensible about what they could and couldn't access in terms of forward bases. Wayne Borean, the absent-minded mad scientist, asks, "This video got me thinking." This is still the US tactical doctrine development video. The British and US systems were wildly different, in part driven by logistics. British tactics and doctrine always has seemed to be more fluid, and it seemed the differences are largely driven by resources. If resource levels do explain the differences, how would reducing US wartime production levels by 50% impact US naval tactics, in your opinion? Well, there's two parts to that. I mean, in World War II, if you cut US wartime production levels by 50%, it's still an overwhelming number of vessels, but there would have had to be a lot harder choices about what you assign to the European theatre and what you assign to the Pacific theatre. Broadly speaking, if you just neatly halve the number of destroyers, destroyer escorts, landing craft, cruisers, carriers, battleships, etc., etc., what you basically end up with is the older craft that are around that were perhaps being used in second line duties, like the old battleships basically being relegated to shore bombardment duty, the Omahas being sent to second line areas, etc. These things have to be brought back into frontline service, and they may suffer higher casualties as a result. Especially when it comes to landing craft, you may see a very, very vitriolic discussion, because if there aren't enough landing craft to supply everything that's needed for various European operations, Torch, Husky, Overlord, etc., etc., and supply the craft that are needed for the island hopping campaign in the Pacific, again, someone's going to have to make a decision, well, which one gets the priority? I suspect that the Americans may start to prioritise the Pacific. That would certainly be Admiral King's request or demand, and simply say to the British, well, if you want there to be invasions in Europe, you're going to have to come up with the landing craft for them, or more of the landing craft than the British historically did. So that's certainly a possibility. At the higher end of things, when you're talking about cruisers, battleships and carriers, the US is still going to significantly outproduce the Japanese, but replacements for the 1942, early 43 wartime losses are obviously therefore going to be coming down the line somewhat slower. So the US may end up fighting more of a holding action after Guadalcanal rather than sort of going on the offensive early in 1943. And they may spend most of 1943 consolidating, raiding, building up their forces, trying to minimize losses even more so than historical, and then really kicking into a high offensive overdrive in late 43, early 44, which of course does give the Japanese some breathing space to try and build up their own fleet a little bit, but it's really not going to change all that much. But what probably will then change is, because you're starting the advance a little bit later, and because you have to be a little bit more casualty averse, not that I'm saying the US Navy was just throwing ships at the enemy and just going, haha, well, you broke that one, we'll send in another one. But, they could take certain tactical risks in the knowledge that if this doesn't pay off or that doesn't pay off, this ship gets badly damaged or sunk, we do have replacements for it. When you don't have those replacements, you have to be a bit more cautious. And as a result, overall, by the time the atomic bomb is developed, you're probably going to still have the US fighting its way through the last outlying islands, as opposed to being in range of the Japanese home islands themselves, which in turn probably means the atomic bombs get used to clear out Iwo Jima or Okinawa or somewhere like that, at least at first. Whether or not that has enough effect to make the Japanese surrender, or they continue to advance and continue to use atomic weapons even further, is, that's the alternate history side of things. But in terms of British tactics and doctrine seeming to be more fluid, that is true to a certain extent, and it's not necessarily production resources that are the problem, it's available resources that are the problem. So if you look at British tactics in, say, the majority of the 19th century running up to just before World War I, when they start to concentrate very heavily around the UK because of the threat of Germany, British tactics basically amount to have a strong enough force to at least hold out or put up a spectacular last stand in any particular area. Obviously have major forces capable of crushing the enemy in the more important zones, with the implicit threat that to take out the British forces on any given station, you might pull it off, but it'll cost you, and by the time you finish that, there'll be an awful lot more turning up to avenge them. And then you get to World War I, the 1900s really, when the concentration starts, and now the British have the one big fleet in the UK, and everything else is just a case of, well, we have some ships on station. There's still that implicit threat to a certain degree, but it's a longer term threat. So whereas before, if you mess with a British ship in the Indian Ocean or in the Pacific, you'd have the Australian squadron or the Mediterranean fleet show up in pretty short order. In the 1900s and 1910s, it's more of a case of the British may send overwhelming numbers of smaller, older ships like pre-dreadnoughts, or you might get a visit from a capital ship like, Von Spee's squadron being blocked out of using the Panama Canal by Princess Royal, but it's going to take longer to get there. When you get into the interwar period and then the run-up to World War II, which is, I think, where most of the question is based around, the US and Britain have theoretically approximately equal fleets, but the US has the benefit of being mostly a single homogenous entity, the continental United States. Yeah, they've got Hawaii and the Philippines and bits and pieces like that, but those are still at least within the main tactical theatre the Americans are looking at, which is the Pacific. So the Americans have this big fleet, and realistically, they only have to worry as their top threat about fighting a single nation, i.e. Japan, in a single theatre. And therefore, that limits your number of tactical options. It limits the number of different decisions you have to make, and so your tactics and doctrine can be a little bit more rigid. Obviously, during fleet problems and stuff, they looked at potential war with European powers, but it wasn't anywhere near as high up the tree of possibilities as a war with Japan. Whereas with the British, because they have this widely scattered empire, and now their fleet is limited in size by the Washington and London treaties, they're forced to have a much more fluid tactical doctrine, because they might end up at war with Germany, they might end up at war with Italy, they might end up at war with Japan, they might, in various circumstances, end up at war with the United States, they might end up at war with all sorts of people, or in low-level conflict. And because they have to guard all these places all over the place, they have to distribute this fleet across the world, and so they can't be as strong in any one place as the US Pacific or Atlantic fleets can be. And so they can't just turn around and go, okay, you fight us here, we fight you here. They have to consider all sorts of ways of adapting to that situation. You know, if somebody declares war over here, do our cruisers directly attack them? Is their fleet small enough? Is their fleet large enough that we may risk a direct fleet confrontation with a battleship or two? And maybe we can draw off one of our own in quickly enough? Or is their fleet so large that we maybe fall back onto defensive and raiding measures and then try and summon a big fleet from home waters and the Mediterranean? Is the war happening in the Mediterranean or the North Sea? And if so, you know, we'll have a margin of superiority, but how many ships from overseas do we have to pull in to get a complete margin of superiority, and so on and so forth. And so because there's so many more possibilities, and the possibilities branch to an extent it's impossible to plan for every single one of them given the limited number of ships available, they're forced to adopt a slightly more fluid and free-thinking doctrine than the US Navy has to in the interwar period. Bjarki Hill-Marson asks, have you done a video about the Battle of Dogger Bank 1915? As of yet, no, I haven't. I will do it at some point, but there's a fairly long list of Wednesday videos that I need to get out before I can look at Dogger Bank. I think I'll probably do it early next year. MG asks, what was the German High Command's reaction to the sinking of Blücher in 1940? Was it hand-waved, or were there some repercussions in the top leadership? And how did the British react to the news of the sinking of a brand new cruiser by an admissibly old fortress? The British reaction was basically a combination of, you know, jolly good for the Norwegians, they bagged a Hun, and if you look at some of the intelligence reports, basically somewhat thinly veiled British sarcasm of, yeah, they did what? They sailed their ships to point blank range of a what? And they expected this to go correctly. How? Okay, maybe they are not quite as smart as they used to be. And then, you know, various counter. There's about 4 or 5 different British reports, intel reports and discussions about, well, the Norwegian campaign generally, but also the whole Oslo Fjord offensive. And yeah, some of them are basically can be summarized as, well, it looks like the Germans have forgotten how to fight a naval war. And then others kind of pointing to other elements of the campaign, like Kipper versus Glowworm, or various German raids of the Graf Spee incident, obviously outside of the campaign, but still evidence of the Kriegsmarine actually still knowing how to fight and going, yeah, this was a tactical screw-up. They probably should have seen that coming, or at least checked if the fortress was still operational, but, you know, let's not write them all off just yet. But on the other hand, it looks like intel is something the Germans are weak in, and we can exploit that. And oh boy, did the British continue to exploit that particular weakness. Anyway, back in Germany, there were 2 main sets of reactions. There was the more public and the more private one. So the more private one was an appreciation that, okay, maybe having a brand new ship, brand new crew, and expecting to be the flagship leading an offensive was not such a good idea. Some people criticised Kometz, the admiral in charge, basically being far too incautious, missing a bunch of cues. But that had the overall net effect that the Kriegsmarine High Command became very unwilling to send out any ship until they were absolutely confident of their capabilities, which is why when you get to something like Operation Rheinebung a bit later on, technically speaking, Tirpitz was physically capable of sailing with Bismarck, but due to the lessons of Blücher and a few others, the Kriegsmarine just turned around and said, there is absolutely no way on this planet we're sending out a newly commissioned ship that's still working up with an inexperienced crew on a mission of any particular significance, because we've learned that's a very good way of losing a ship. And so Tirpitz stayed at home. The more immediate, more public issue was an immediate massive spat with the army, because of course there were a lot of German army troops on Blücher when she sank. So the army commissioned a report that basically blamed the Kriegsmarine for the loss of several thousand, well, over 1,000 German lives, because not a lot of people who were on Blücher made it off, and for screwing up the invasion of Oslo to the point that the Norwegian royal family was able to get out, and the whole thing was very embarrassing. To which the Kriegsmarine fired back with its own report, and bear in mind the army was also accusing the sailors of not really helping their army comrades, and a lot of the army soldiers didn't know how to swim. The Kriegsmarine fired back with their own report that pointed out that actually a fair number of Kriegsmarine sailors had been trying to help the army troops out. It just, everything was on fire and exploding, and the ship was sinking into freezing cold water, so it was remarkably lucky that there were any survivors at all, and also kind of went off on several pages of diatribe about basically how, this is the best that they were going to get, and the army couldn't be expected to organise an amphibious landing across the Kiel Canal, let alone over in Norway, and the army were a bunch of idiots when it came to anything that involved seawater, so they should shut up and let the Kriegsmarine get on with it. And this went back and forth a fair bit between the army and the Kriegsmarine until eventually everyone kind of settled down, forgot about it, and got on with other business. At which point everyone quietly tried to forget about the whole thing. Switch 374 asks, how exactly was a projectile loaded into a muzzle-loading rifled cannon? Since the purpose of the rifling is to engage the rotating band and impart spin to the projectile on firing, does the loading process engage the rotating band and not go in far enough to disengage? In any case, it seems to me that it required a significant amount of force to load the projectile. So it depends very much on exactly what era of rifled cannon you're looking at. Because in the very early days, when they were perhaps a little bit smaller apart from anything else, you could load them from the front relatively easily because they didn't have driving bands so much as they had driving studs. So yeah, it required a little bit of work, but you could force them in. It wasn't the same massive amount of effort that you would associate later on when you have much more or many more grooves and a full-sized band. Once the shells became larger, and you did get driving bands as opposed to driving studs, and obviously much increased rifling, etc., then yes, it would become impossible pretty much to hand ram them. And then you got arrangements like this. So this is quite quick. This is the early 1870s on Devastation and Thunderer, and you can see at this point the charge and the shell is rammed home and engaging with the rifling by a mechanical, usually hydraulic driven rammer that's actually built into the ship. So you just literally force it in there with a huge amount of energy. Brian Smith asks, do you think there would have been much impact on the naval war during the US Civil War if the Confederates captured Norfolk Navy Yard completely intact, or if the Union had managed to get everything out before the rebels got there? Well, long term, the Union industrial advantage is still massive, but short term, if they'd somehow managed to capture the whole thing intact, then yes, there could have been a fairly significant impact on the naval war in that year, basically. Obviously, in neither case do the Confederates have a half-burned-out hull they can use to convert into an ironclad, aka CSS Virginia, but if they capture Norfolk entirely intact, well, they still get access to over 1,000 pieces of artillery, which they got anyway, because it turns out, big artillery guns don't burn very easily, but they'd also get access to all the supplies and the sheds that made up the Norfolk, or as it was at the time, Gosport Navy Yard. But more critically, if they can find the crews for them, they get access to a whole bunch of ships. There's a few large steam frigates, including Merrimack, but there's also the bulk of the US Navy's old ships of the line, at least 4 or 5 74 gunners, and of course the USS Pennsylvania. Now, with access to over 1,000 guns in the yard itself, it's not inconceivable that somebody could have put 2 and 2 together and gone, right, let's take the biggest and meanest guns we can get, fit them on the lower gun decks of the 74s and the Pennsylvania, sail them out with lesser guns on the upper gun decks, at which point you have some very, very heavily armed vessels which can near enough certainly drive off the Union blockade. Yes, the Union steamships like Merrimack's sister ships, etc., will be faster and more agile because they have their steam engines. And yes, firing large shell guns will make the utility of these larger ships of the line somewhat less, but as Lissa showed, a well-built ship of the line can still stand up to shell fire for a reasonably long period of time. And of course, if they're armed with the pick of Norfolk Navy Yard's artillery park, they can, be firing shells back with quite considerable effect. Now, of course, the solution to that would be the Union brings in greater numbers of ships with lots of shell guns, and they can end up obviously building ironclads, etc. as well. But for at least several months, if not up to a year, it might give the Confederacy local sea superiority, which might help open up trade a little bit more, which might in turn help them with obviously keeping their war effort going, so it will prolong the war. Also give us an opportunity to have another massive naval action, because at some point the Union's going to have to come in and deal with these ships. Now, the flip side, if the Union gets everything out somehow, it's the least plausible of the two scenarios, because, okay, with a little bit more notice, sailing or towing the ships out could potentially be done. But as I said, there's over 1,000 bits of artillery in there, plus all the naval stores and supplies. Sure, you could sling a bunch of them onto the ships, but I don't see any easy way of moving that much heavy metal at any kind of short notice. But assuming they move the bulk or all of it, well, that, by the flip side, shortens the war a little bit. Yes, the Confederates don't get their hands on the wreck of Merrimack, so they can't create CSS Virginia per se. That's not to say they can't just create an ironclad of some description out of some other ship that they have to hand. But more importantly, obviously, it means the Union now has access to a bunch more ships, which they can use to strengthen the blockade with. And if they've managed to haul all these guns out with them, that is perhaps the biggest thing, because 1,000+ pieces of heavy artillery added to the Union side and subtracted from the Confederate side as compared to the historical lineup, that might make a difference in some circumstances, both in terms of the Union having access to some heavy firepower at certain battles, and the Confederates not having access to heavy guns for certain defences. Sam Signorelli asks, when did IFF systems come into being? I always thought they were a Vietnam-era thing. So IFF systems actually come about in the mid-war period, with some of the more advanced systems actually available by as early as late 1943. Initially, they start out as very simple systems. They operate on a single frequency. They basically look for a signal pulse on that frequency, and when they detect a signal pulse on that frequency, they just pulse back a response uncoded. So that's good for basically just saying, yes, I'm friendly, and that's about it. And by the time you get to the end of World War II, they've evolved reasonably significantly to the point that they can operate on a few different frequencies. They can both look for and transmit on a few different frequencies. And They can also respond with basic coded responses. Now, that's nothing like what you'd have much, much later on, but it does allow, by the end of the war, for IFF systems to allow you to delineate what kinds of craft are responding. So, whereas before, if you sent out an IFF ping in, say, late 42, early mid 43, or to be honest, 43, 44, given the prevalence of older systems, even then, you might get a bunch of responses like, okay, friendly there, friendly there, friendly there, friendly there, friendly there, friendly there. And it's like, okay, well, that friendly is at like 0 feet, so that's probably a ship. That friendly is like at 15,000 feet, so that's probably an aircraft, and so on and so forth. Whereas if you're using the latest systems at the end of the war, the IFF would say, okay, this is a ship, this is a torpedo bomber, that's a dive bomber, this is a transport, this is a fighter. It wouldn't tell you which fighter it was. It wouldn't, differentiate between a Corsair and a Hellcat, or tell you the squadron number or anything, but you'd know it was a fighter. Something that the Japanese would exploit towards the end of the war, because they could read the IFF signals as well and simulate the pings, so they could see the American aircraft coming. Not that it did them a tremendous amount of good. But one of the weaknesses of the early IFF systems was that they were very basic. They were just looking for a ping that said, identify yourself. And that ping was just a ping on a given frequency of a given amount of strength. Unfortunately, this meant that if you had a full strike of aircraft parked out on the deck of a carrier, and someone swept the appropriate frequency radar signal over, obviously with the island on the starboard side, over to port, then you'd get all of the IFFs responding, which, okay, that's fine, except that they were in such close proximity that the strength of their response, which was on the same frequency and very basic, would trigger the IFFs around them, because they'd be like, oh, another signal, I must respond, which of course made all the IFFs around them go, oh, another signal, I must respond. And you'd end up with basically a feedback loop of IFFs going, hello, 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 and then you'd have to shut the system off and get the aircraft to fly away to stop the cacophony of IFF signals, which did have a few interesting side effects in the latter part of the war. Sean Morrison asks, during the World War I and World War II eras, was the concept of variable pitch propellers considered or applied to naval vessels? So I did partially cover this in a previous Drydock, in as much as it was known about, it was considered, but it wasn't usually implemented because of the cost and complexity of a variable pitch propeller, as opposed to the benefits when it comes to full-on warships. But it was occasionally implemented where the benefits outweighed those drawbacks. So here is an LCSL, Landing Craft Support brackets large, and these ships were equipped with twin variable pitch propellers because, well, as you can probably tell from both the designation and the layout, these are designed to be inshore fire support vessels, dedicated ones, as opposed to using destroyers, which would also get in on the act. But because these are designed to operate in very, very shallow water and at very low speeds, but also have to pick up the speed a bit to get out and about in the open ocean, these were equipped with the variable pitch propellers to help with those duties. But as I said, compared to the sheer number of other vessels that were built, the LCSLs and ships like them that had such propellers were definitely in the minority. Alec Ruby asks, finally, why didn't the Germans send 2 or 3 submarines into Scapa Flow rather than just the one at the start of World War II? Wouldn't the possibility of nearly crippling the home fleet be beneficial for the Germans later on in the war, and with the surface raiders at the start of the war? Basically because getting into and out of Scapa Flow was initially thought to be impossible, because the Germans basically did the same thing of considering, well, what kind of defences have we put on our naval bases to make sure the enemy doesn't send submarines in to sink all of our ships? Well, we are going to assume that the British will do the same to their naval bases. And generally speaking, that held true. Scapa Flow in particular did have a significant degree of anti-submarine defences, but they hadn't been fully upgraded since World War I. Submarines had gotten slightly more capable, and so there were a few gaps. If you're an extremely talented submarine commander and knew where to look, and that's where Prien and U-47 came in. But that was very much on his own initiative kind of thing, as opposed to a specific dedicated mission. And having multiple boats, obviously not really able to coordinate on a minute-by-minute basis, means the chances of the others running into the existing Scapa Flow defences being detected obviously increases the chances of failure of the mission. Plus, although Royal Oak was in Scapa Flow, the home fleet as a whole wasn't when U-47 arrived. So, realistically speaking, even if they specifically planned it, then sending extra subs actually just makes the chances of the whole thing failing much more likely, because of course if they find a submarine tangled up in the defences, then people are going to start looking for the others, or at least start having a poke around to see if anyone else did get in, which would compromise the subs that had managed to get inside. And that brings us to the end of the Drydock for this week. Thank you very much for listening. Nothing in particular major to announce at this point in terms of channel admin, other than by the time you're listening to this, we'll have been through a second summer heatwave in the UK, so even more parts of the UK would have been on fire or just melted. But normal service should be continuing. Thanks for listening.